We've heard a lot in the past few years about mindfulness, and I've written a little bit about it myself. Now, mindfulness seems like a reasonable idea. Seems that making people more aware of themselves and their surroundings, more conscious of their lives moment to moment, more at ease with their lives might be a good thing. But when does mindfulness cross the line from personal betterment tool to tool of capitalism? That's the topic of my next guest's book, and I've been looking forward to speaking with him for some time. Ronald Purser is professor of management in the College of Business and the educational doctorate in leadership program. That's a long title in the College of Education at San Francisco State University. He is also an ordained teacher in the Zen Dharma tradition of Korean Zen, Taigo order, and he is the author of a book entitled McMindfulness, and it is on how, in fact, the full title is, let me get it right, and of course, I always screw up this part. McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality. I love that. So as you said, as you know, I've been looking forward to speaking with him. Ronald Purser, thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thank you, Richard. Pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start with this, Ron. What gave you the idea to write this book about mindfulness?
Well, I'm a professor of management, and I noticed around 2010, a lot of companies, especially around Silicon Valley, started jumping on the bandwagon, bringing mindfulness programs into their firms, into their companies. And I've done a lot of management consulting in my day, and I know how fads come and go, and basically how some of these programs are used to basically pacify workers, to try to distill dissent, suppress worker dissent, and put all the burden back onto employees to adjust and cope with basically what amounts to very toxic corporate culture. So that was partly the reason. The other reason is I was sort of stunned by how rapidly this so-called mindfulness revolution took off, because, you know, at one time, as Buddhism made itself popular in the West, it was a countercultural, anti-establishment sort of hippie-ish movement back when Zen was popular in the day. So when it morphed into a $1.5 billion industry, that really got my attention, and I started to take a step back and kind of take a look at what was actually going on with this so-called movement, and became more and more suspicious and more concerned in terms of how what was a spiritual practice became co-opted and basically commodified and instrumentalized to basically serve corporate interest, and basically in other settings, for example, even the U.S. military, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Marines have been training soldiers in some shape or form of mindfulness. So that really sparked my interest and concern.
Well, and as you know, I have some interest in this area myself and wrote about it back in 2012, 2013. So it's something I've tracked, not at the level you have in this book, which is highly readable as well as extremely interesting. But there's so many directions where I'd love to take the conversation. But let's start with this. I mean, at some point I want to go into the historical role certain forms of Buddhism have played. But let's start with this. We have, among other things, seen the sort of mainstreaming of the counterculture. And you mentioned that when, of course, Buddhism is an ancient tradition, but as you say, when Zen became popular in the 50s and 60s, it was very much a counterculture tradition. But then a lot of things that come from the counterculture tradition, the beats of the 50s, the movement of the 60s, and so on, a lot of those things became mainstream over time. Rock and roll became corporatized. Underground movies became more of an above ground phenomenon. Fashion, colors, breaking of old gender stereotypes. Everything sort of found its way into the maw of corporate hegemony, somehow it seems to me. So I guess, on one level, my reaction is, why would Buddhism be any different? Why wouldn't people also find a way, first of all, to market it, and then secondly, to use it to optimize, if they're not in the marketing of business, why wouldn't they use it to optimize employee productivity or whatever else? Was this just sort of an inevitable historical development, the way things have gone the last 60 years? Or what do you think?
I think you're right. We know how capitalism can take what's initially a radical idea and co-opt it and basically neuter it, tame it, domesticate it. So I think you're absolutely right. But I think we see with mindfulness a long process of decontextualization that happened over a period of 100 years or so. What we have now is basically an extremely stripped down version of mindfulness that's been separated and extracted from its ethical and moral context, and along with teachings that were meant to dissolve attachment to one's ego, and it's been turned around into a self-help technique, which can be done by using an app on your iPhone, for example. So it's quite different than its original purpose. And I think you're making a real good point, though, is we have taken an ancient spiritual tradition and recontextualized it within Western consumer capitalism. So you're absolutely right that these forces have been unleashed, and then we've unbundled this practice, and we've allowed sort of the default mode of Western consumerism, individualism, basically this notion that mindfulness is a tool, it's a technique, it's ethically neutral, it can basically help you have. There's books out there on Amazon, for example, Mindful Sex, Mindful Dog Owners. You name it. So, maybe it is inevitable in some ways, the commodification of these practices. On the other hand, if we look historically, these practices do offer ways to cut through a lot of our worst human tendencies towards greed and anger and hatred, and basically a sense of delusion that we're separate from the world. So, these practices do have potential, but they've been neutered and denatured and turned into kind of a banal therapeutic technique.
Yeah, and again, we're talking with Ronald Purser, author of the new book McMindfulness, and Ron, it seems to me that implicit throughout your book and the critique in your book and in the whole topic itself, there are two fundamental flaws with this sort of corporatization of mindfulness, which is essentially a corporatization of Buddhism, I would say, although feel free to challenge me if you disagree. But I think, and the best way I can put them is there are two two dimensions of delusion at work here: one individual and one collective. And let me just explain what I mean by that very briefly. One, by the individual delusion, I mean, if the self doesn't exist, which is ultimately where these practices should, in my view, should lead us, is that, as you say, the illusion of separateness from other is exactly that, an illusion, then, why so much emphasis on you being comfortable, me being comfortable? I must become more comfortable. I must become more productive. I must become, why all the I stuff when the ultimate goal is to get beyond the I? And that's the consumer dimension of it. And then there's the corporate selling dimension of this, which is also very much implicit in your work, the collective delusion, which is why should necessarily all the employees of a certain corporation be optimized through mindfulness into becoming more productive employees, when maybe what they should be doing with a heightened sense of mindful awareness of their situation is realizing that they and their colleagues are in a lousy system that needs to change, right? So the individual and the collective. I'm struggling with that, but I think it's fair to say that that's a theme of your book, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of talk now about the importance of self-care. That's kind of the buzzword now. We've moved from self-help to self-care. But I never hear anything beyond that. The common trope is that change starts from within, and this notion of personal growth. And it's sort of the implicit cultural messages are that the individual, it's up to the individual to change from within. And to me, that is sort of a form of social myopia. But I think you're absolutely right that I think it's sort of tied to New Age spirituality, this cultivation, so it's kind of a cult of the self. I think that comes out of the late 70s and 80s, that mindfulness is sort of building on that soil. But I think you're right that it's kind of turned into a hedonic form of happiness, about making middle to upper white class people, the so-called mindfulness movement is really appealing to the middle to upper white class sector of society, then help make them feel just a little bit better, so they can jump back into what they were doing and conduct business as usual. But I think this trend reinforces a sense of an isolated sense of privatized self that somehow has unfettered agency to take care of its well-being, that's not contingent on any kind of social or economic or political conditions. And I think from a Buddhist point of view, the focus on the self is really what is at the heart of Buddhist meditation, is to take the focus off oneself, or to use these practices to see through the constructed nature of the self, and to go beyond the self, so that we can become more compassionate and less selfish and self-serving. So I think that I think you're making a really good point, that if we take these what are considered private interior delusions, such as greed and ill will and a sense of being an independent self, those three mental poisons have become collectively institutionalized. They've taken on a life of their own. In other words, institutions now are generating these sorts of toxins in our body politic. So now we need new approaches, which don't just tell people, go off on your own and go off on a silent retreat by yourself and meditate. We really need more of a social or civic form of mindfulness that can address the collective nature of these stresses. So stress isn't just a privatized issue. It's not a depoliticized problem. Stress is a sociopolitical problem. It's not just strictly a biological problem of the individual.
And again, we're talking with Ronald Purser, author of the new book, McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalism. Well, I can't see the rest of the title on this thing. Ron, and as you were thinking, the only, even mindfulness itself, as it gets kind of twisted into this practice you described, originated with this the reflecting on the self, the body processes, the breathing and so on. Even when, in my understanding of Buddhist practice, even when you do that, it's to get beyond the self. I think of the Japanese Zen teacher Dogen saying many centuries ago, to study the self is to know the self. To know the self is to forget the self. The goal is to forget the self. And you mentioned New Age spirituality, which reminded me that one of the surprise heroes in your book, even though she makes but a brief appearance, is Marianne Williamson. Because Marianne Williamson spoke at Wisdom 2.0, which is an annual mindfulness conference that I wrote about, generating some heat in the process one year. But Marianne asked, I'm reading from your book now, asked why a spiritual teacher should, quote, come here. This buying as Wisdom 2.0 was, at least at the time, basically a Silicon Valley spirituality event. Marianne asked why a spiritual teacher should, quote, come here and be a dancing monkey to help a bunch of rich capitalists talk about the fact that they can have a more compassionate workplace, end quote, while ignoring the poverty outside it to which they contribute. Quote, only in modern America could we come up with some ersatz version of spirituality that gives us a pass on addressing the unnecessary human suffering in our midst. Our lives, she quoting Martin Luther King, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Good old Marianne, huh?
Yeah, even she gets it. And it was kind of prescient in some ways. So, yeah, Wisdom 2.0, I actually call it in the book Arrogance 2.0. Basically, it's a gathering of Silicon Valley elites and hipsters, tech hipsters. It's kind of a bazaar, basically, of people hawking apps, neuro hacking devices, and the who's who of the mindfulness movement basically shows up and does their TED Talks and so forth. But interestingly enough, I think it was the year after Marianne Williamson took them to task. There was actually a protest that occurred at Wisdom 2.0. And at the time, there was a presentation that was beginning to start, and it was the people at Google who were on stage, and they were beginning to start their session. And the Heart of the City, this group, which is a social activist group, crashed the event and unfurled these banners saying eviction-free San Francisco. They were protesting basically Google's driving up the rents, and there were these forced evictions going on in San Francisco, along with all the Google buses that were clogging up the roadways. And it was quite an intense protest that disrupted the event. And one of the main Google mindfulness teachers kind of intervened and said, well, okay, let's everyone calm down. Let's just check in with our bodies now and see how we feel about people with different views than ours. And as that was going on, these big burly bouncers came in, and there was a tug of war going on between the female protesters and these bouncers. But basically, after this occurred, after they took the protesters off the stage, they basically congratulated themselves about how well they managed the event by just ignoring the message of the protesters and mindfully watching their breath.
Well, which is actually crosses the line in my mind from mindfulness as tool of capitalism to mindfulness as tool of criminal self-delusion. And, that to me is such an egregious story. But Ron, I think I might correct you slightly on timeline. I don't think it was the year after Marianne, because I think I covered it after Marianne had been and gone. And I covered it, I think, in 2012. And I remember, because I got enormous heat for critiquing it the way I did, and I felt extraordinarily alone. I was not aware of Marianne's comments. I did write in my piece that Eckhart Tolle, of all people, was similarly somewhat critical of, not quite as eloquently, I would say, as Marianne, but was somewhat critical of the escapist nature of the whole venture. But I felt extremely alone and out on a limb in this criticism until afterwards I saw that that this protest had taken place. So I know it was subsequent to whenever I covered it. So just a mild timeline there. But I guess that gets me to another question I'd love to talk to you about. I felt very alone. I was publicly targeted for a lot of criticism for speaking up against this. I actually had the experience at another Buddhist conference of 2 or 3 different very prominent American or at least Western Buddhist teachers coming up to me and saying, I agree with what you wrote. What you wrote is very important. And me saying to them, well, I feel very exposed and vulnerable right now. How about saying that publicly? Oh, no, I can't possibly. I have reasons why I can't. I'm just wondering what your experience has been making these critiques of this kind of corporate mindfulness.
Well, I've felt almost the same as you, Richard. I wrote a very short article in 2013, which kind of sparked the debate around mindfulness. It was called Beyond McMindfulness. I wrote it with David Loy, who is also a Western Buddhist teacher, and it was published in the Huffington Post, and it went viral. And I was sort of stunned by the sort of emails I was receiving by so-called mindfulness teachers and supporters. That they weren't very mindful. They were quite, I would say, hostile. And I felt extremely alone for at least 2 or 3 years. But slowly but surely, people started to take a closer look, more closer scrutiny of what was going on in the mindfulness circles. And over time, a network has kind of formed that, especially people in the humanities and fields like sociology, anthropology, philosophy. There's a lot of people that are writing more critical perspectives on mindfulness. But I remember being trolled quite viciously on Facebook by a couple of mindfulness teachers. So I sympathize with what you went through as well.
Yeah, and I was, threatened at various points, told things that were, direct assaults on my integrity and reputation. I mean, really terrible stuff. So we can sympathize with each other on that. But without naming any names, I'll tell you a quick anecdote because I want your thought on it. In the midst of all this, someone unbeknownst to me asked a very famous American Buddhist whether that person would like to somehow mediate between me and the Wisdom 2.0 people, which I don't know what I would have thought of it because I was never asked. And the answer, who had behaved with enormous aggression toward me, and the response that was given was, "Oh, I see they're both in pain." And I felt that was such an out because I feel that, okay, they're both in pain, but maybe one is right and one is wrong. And maybe it's not me. I don't know. But the idea that pain is somehow a sort of get out of karmic jail free card, I don't fully understand. And I don't understand why. I mean, we've seen the Christian community engage in intense political debate between the conservative Southern Baptists and the liberal Southern Baptists. We've seen Jewish community have internal debates, Muslim community. Is there a sort of, and I wonder if it's particular to Western or American Buddhism, but and I should clarify by that I mean convert Buddhism especially. Is there a desire, perhaps, and is the mindfulness movement part of this, a desire to just kind of escape from conflicted or painful situations instead of confronting them head on with whatever the implications of that might be?
Well, I think there are several things going on. There's kind of an absolutizing of sort of the universal notion that we can rise above our emotions and so forth. I think that that's kind of a form of spiritual bypassing that a lot of I've seen this in Western Buddhist sanghas, Buddhist communities, where they say, well, let's just see things as they are, and it's sort of a privileging of the absolute, and kind of a denigration or a devaluing of our humanness in some ways. I mean, it's kind of ironic, but I also think there's some sort of norms, consensus norms around being nice, and one shouldn't engage in debates. But if you look at the long history of the Buddhist tradition, it's the reason why it's a living tradition is because there were fierce debates going on within Buddhist sects and across various Buddhist schools. So I just think there's some sort of play nice sort of rule or norm which prevents this kind of open discourse, which I think would be very healthy. And there may be interest involved, that people are trying to maintain a particular image, whatever it may be. It's hard to say.
I think your point about the historical arguments in Buddhist history is a great one. And I mean, I remember, I think, chuckling at the time that, if you read some of the history of Japanese Zen, for example, and some of the arguments that used to go on with Zen masters there, where one would call the other, I can't even say it on the air, but, a 6-foot-long meat tube filled with feces and these kinds of elaborate, which I wouldn't recommend as a form of political debate myself, but I mean, the idea that they would engage each other at a very intense level, and that in fact Dharma combat was part of the process, and that now we don't even want to discuss anything if it's mildly uncomfortable is interesting. But in the few minutes we have left, Ronald Purser, I'd love to talk to you about whether there's something cyclical going on with history here, because Buddhism, like other religions, and again, I'm deliberately linking mindfulness and Buddhism because I think it arises from the Buddhist tradition, has it's been used. You mentioned the military using mindfulness. Well, the Japanese military used Buddhism during the Second World War, and Brian Victoria, who's a historian and a Zen teacher, wrote a fascinating book about that, as you know, Zen at War. And there have been other periods in history where Buddhism has become part of institutional power, one kind or another. Is there sort of a kind of cyclical process going on here where occasionally a spiritual tradition will become enmeshed with power and there'll have to be a rebel breakaway faction to remind it of its origins? Or am I reading too much into all of this?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And if we look at Buddhism in the East, it was a monastic tradition, and these monasteries depended for their support on royal patronage, on the emperor, kings, and so forth. So they were not prone to having a politically activist orientation. So we really don't have much to look towards if we look to the past with Buddhism in terms of a more socially engaged form of it. And I think you're right. As it's moved to the West, it has taken root in our major private and public institutions. And it's done so in such a way by cooperating with them. The mindfulness missionaries were really intent on establishing their presence in, for example, public schools, the U.S. military, corporations, but they had to do it in a way by working with the elites within those institutions to gain their cooperation, to bring the programs into those settings. And I think over time they are co-opted by those interests. So we're at a juncture, I think, that where we do need to break away. How can we basically decouple these practices from corporate interest and from the market ethos? I think that's the challenge. And there's a very small movement called socially engaged Buddhism, which is trying to do that. And that kind of actually started with Thich Nhat Hanh, as you know, who was very politically active. He was nominated by Martin Luther King for the Nobel Peace Prize for his, kind of combining his Buddhist practice with political resistance, social activism, anti-war protest. And he has a very strong sense of how mindfulness should be socially engaged. So I think you're right. It's going to take more of a grassroots movement and not working as cooperatively with institutions in order to forge a more socially engaged form of Buddhism and mindfulness.
And which makes perfect sense, because no path to truth that I'm aware of in human history has ever involved the kinds of creature comforts that might go along with, I mean, very rarely does it come with a benefit package, for example. So, I think people, if they want to pursue Buddhism, mindfulness, truth, awareness, might be well advised to look outside of institutions. And Ronald Purser, your book does a great job illustrating the foibles of that, as well as, offering a, suggestion of how to get out of it. So again, the book is McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality. Ron Purser, thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard, for having me. It was a pleasure.